Oh, that's really interesting. So missing from the ending of the anime is chapter 108, the clear epilogue of Takashi Obata and Tsugumi Oba's absolutely titanic 2003 manga, Death Note. It describes a reversion of the world that, while Kira's influence is certainly known and his effect felt, in a sort of twisted plasticity, the crime rates begin to rise again, the people start to languish again, and everything is, as it probably was, back to order. But in its last few panels, there's a particularly haunting, somber, and short scene that depicts a few people, loyal followers of Kira, that, in highly ritualistic group behavior, pray for what seems to be his return. And though the world has ultimately remained unchanged, Kira's made his mark nevertheless. But I think I'm getting ahead of myself here. Death Note, in short, is a campy supernatural cat-and-mouse thriller where Light Yagami comes across a device that kills people if you know their name and face. Of course, over the course of the series, several stipulations and conditions emerge, structuring the process of mass murder as being very orderly, but that's a topic for another day. Light comes to the conclusion that he's going to kill criminals, and in the process craft a completely new, just world where he would reign as a new god. This prompts a concerted effort by Interpol with the help of an eccentric super detective known as L, and the preceding episodes are a continuous string of characters attempting to outwit each other. Now, the reason why the differences between the ending of the anime and the manga are really interesting is because it's a really simple concept that underlines a lot of its social and visual media: apocalypticism. And through an incredibly complex and hybridized use of apocalyptic signals, Death Note mimetically constructs a very peculiar, but at the same time very accurate social malaise ongoing in Japanese society. This connection is sort of a really strange thing because we usually associate apocalyptic fiction with visible catastrophe. For instance, the ruinous Neo-Tokyo of Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira is the most famous example of apocalypse in anime. We can see apocalypticism in there, almost as if it were a completely tangible thing. In Death Note, destruction is hard to gauge, especially at the beginning, if only because of how it depicts social orders. The governments don't collapse, not really, but simply shift and try to adapt to what Kira is doing. Light still goes to school, Light still works, Light still has friends and obligations, but we have to disengage apocalypticism from simply an understanding of destruction. In fact, Death Note's dependence on apocalypticism is a little bit more classical. Originally, the term apocalypse was used as a revelation to disclose information to certain people that was, to quote Motoko Tanaka, unseen by others. The Shinigami themselves are revelatory devices, and Light confiding in Misa and Mikami is itself a parallel to disclosure. From the 2nd century AD, however, the idea, notably in Judeo-Christian communities, shifted through various dialogues. Sometimes it would mean the unveiling, sometimes it would be the final war between good and evil, and sometimes it would be an allegory for oppression. But what threads through most of these doctrines is the duality of apocalypticism's audience. Not only did it become an element for those privy to unseen knowledge, it also became a social release for those unchosen. And if we remember Light's sanctimonious speech, he will become the god of a new world, but at the same time he's also the voice of justice, a beacon of hope for those downtrodden and incapable of defending themselves. Here we see the duality, and whether it's true or not isn't that important, but rather that Light is drawing upon rhetoric that's highly recollective of this sort of fiction. Furthermore, Light's declaration of his more perverse intentions to Ryuk starkly emblazoned behind sun rays is itself highly Kyoistic. Light cropping himself up as a ruler of a new world through his own doctrinal sense of justice that, as every episode continues to degrade in nuance, really underpins the hugely dichotomous Judeo-Christian black and white, righteous and sinful narrative that's dominated Western apocalypticism. And you can find the same Judeo-Christian sensibility in some of its art. For instance, in the first opening, Light and Ryuk are positioned in a way that references Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam. Later on, Naomi Misora is shown to be holding Ray Penbar's body in a way reminiscent of Pieta, also by Michelangelo. In fact, the first thing Light says in the series is, "Follow the teachings of God and receive his blessings, and so it shall be that the seas will once again become bountiful, the raging storms will subside." And to judge someone so permanently as to kill them without any chance of repentance is highly recollective of Revelations. But what makes the differences in the ending so interesting then, if Death Note is just depending on a Judeo-Christian sense of the apocalypse? Well, the thing is, it's not. Not entirely. Dennis Frolic, in an article titled Evil Must Be Punished, Apocalyptic Religion in the television series Death Note, an article that's hugely influenced my understanding of the show's use of apocalyptic language, states that the work incorporates but never really strongly engages with its apocalyptic symbolism. And he's right. Light never really gets punished for his actions. He's wildly successful throughout most of the series, and there's no real catharsis since it's implied that he doesn't really go to meet any punishment. And Frolic goes on to conclude that since Obata and Oba both have a hands-off approach to their symbolism, which is accurate, we can really only engage with the work on how it stands by itself, as well as how people respond to it. By foregrounding what the work says within a sort of epistemological vacuum, Frolic concludes that Death Note's apocalypticism without any serious punishment is likely supporting the ideas it professes. But this is where I disagree. This is where the ending differences matter and why these panels in this chapter is so unbelievably interesting. We have to remember the context of cultural apocalypticism. Motoko Tanaka's noted that apocalypticism in the West versus the East, and for this case, Japan, are very different when it comes to the treatment of eschatological time. She states that a Western apocalypse has traditionally been associated with linear ends, that when it's over, it's, well, over. But that's not the ending we see in Death Note. Instead, the manga reverts society, if only marginally changed, to it before. And the words of the people who still believe in Kira underline a central tenet in classical Japanese apocalypticism that Frolic ignores: cyclicality. The world reverts, the world goes back, the world restarts. In this context, the meaning of Shinsekai, New World, isn't likely a Kyoistic one where divine rulership over 1,000 years precedes a definitive end, but a hybridization. Death Note's apocalyptic language is split into two major distinctions, visual and allegorical. Visually, it draws upon Judeo-Christian elements to crop up its story. But in terms of its ending, its structure, it's more akin to the cyclicality of Buddhist apocalypticism. And it's really only that ending that really depicts a nakedly classical Eastern approach to apocalyptic narrative. But if we're talking about eschatology, then understanding the end is, in fact, ipso facto important. And in Death Note, the end is implied to depend on archetypes of transhistoricity. Just as how this Kira was defeated, the hanging thread of Oba and Obata's last panels and the mundanity of Light's ascension to notoriety crops up the idea that another Kira may emerge, that another Kira will likely emerge. In short, Death Note draws upon a visual and surface language that's very Judeo-Christian, but its ending is notably non-Judeo-Christian. It's a hybrid. But why is this hybridization important? What does it seek to accomplish? Well, if we look at it from the perspective of this work incorporating two distinct elements of the end, then we can find a highly abstract but incredibly important element to understanding Death Note, and in many ways Japan's implementation of apocalypticism. But I think just Death Note alone isn't enough. We have to get a better idea of the literature, of the history. Death Note isn't the only show that depicts apocalypticism. And frankly, while it's an astoundingly interesting case study, it's simply scaffolding for a society with a highly complex history with calamity and revelation. So, to get a better idea of these messages, and how something like apocalypticism could creep into and still succeed in a modern show like Death Note, let's go back a bit further. Let's go back to 1945.